North Korea is supplying at least 50,000 combat troops to Russia to be deployed in their war with Ukraine. That's in addition to the thousands of other help that they've been giving in terms of ballistic missiles, which rain down on Ukraine every day, and other forms of ammunition and combat support. This is the No Delusion Zone for Tuesday, August 11th, 2026. We're going to be discussing that and some other related stories with my guest in just a little bit. But before I do that, I want to get into some reporting on what I just talked about, North Korea, and then another topic, a little more positive, I think, about what's going on with Ukraine. And the first one has the title of North Korea arms Russia. South Korea says no to Ukraine weapons. And the article opens, and this is just an excerpt. South Korea is refusing to provide lethal weapons to Ukraine, even as Kyiv says North Korea is supplying Russia with missiles and troops, and accused Moscow of using North Korea ballistic missiles in a deadly overnight barrage. Russian attacks across Ukraine killed at least 9 people and wounded dozens overnight, Ukrainian officials said on Tuesday. The southeastern city of Zaporizhzhia was the hardest hit, with 6 people killed and 19 wounded, according to President Volodymyr Zelensky. The city was struck with North Korean ballistic missiles, zircons, and guided aerial bombs, Zelensky said. It was a vicious attack, calculated to inflict maximum damage, specifically on civilian infrastructure. And I want to then go to a couple of brief clips about this, and then I'm going to get into, like I said, a little bit more positive story for Ukraine.
Ukraine's president is warning tens of thousands of North Korean troops are about to enter the war. Volodymyr Zelensky again pleading for the international community to intervene as the death toll in his country continues to climb.
Fires on the outskirts of Kyiv. Ballistic missile attacks near the capital, killing at least 3 people, including a child, and injuring others in what's been one of the deadliest weeks for civilians in this war. President Volodymyr Zelensky is pleading for allies to expedite the production of Patriot interceptors as the country runs low on a key tool used to defend its skies. Travelling to Serbia for his first official visit, a nation historically a friend of Russia.
But I just hope, without any real facts behind these hopes, that this will end tomorrow.
But the Ukrainian president is warning a new wave could be about to begin after receiving intel that North Korea is planning to send up to 50,000 troops into the war. In central Kyiv, thousands fill a cathedral and public square to remember one of their own, Alexei Yukov, who died days ago after years of service retrieving and identifying bodies from the front line. He too becoming yet another fatality in this vicious conflict. In London, Josh Bavis, 9 News.
And this brief clip from President Zelensky. And as I said, a slightly more positive story that I want to, we're going to be discussing both of these in just a little bit. But this one says that Ukraine could strike Moscow with homegrown ballistic missiles this autumn, the developer says. And the article opens, that's the wrong one. This is the article that opens with that story. Ukraine could launch its first strikes on Moscow using domestically developed ballistic missiles as early as this autumn, according to Dennis Schlitterman, owner and chief designer of defense company Firepoint. Speaking in an interview with journalist Dmitry Gordon, published on July 27th, Schlitterman said the company is in the final stage of testing a new missile system. Once test launches are completed, the missiles could begin being used against targets inside Russia. The military will decide where to strike, but I think these will be immediately be significant targets, Schlitterman said. And now that I've covered some of the major topics that we want to discuss, let me introduce my very special guest, my old friend, Jonathan Fink, who is the creator and host of Silicon Curtain. Welcome back, Jonathan.
Great to be here, although obviously some of those stories are disturbing. Not surprising, unfortunately, though.
No, and I know that you've just returned from another trip to Kyiv. So before we get into these specific stories, any highlights or any points you like to bring up about your most recent visit there?
No, except that seeing some of those strikes with your own eyes or experiencing them, being in the same place, it means that these news headlines don't have that sort of distance, or that comfort of distance, or feeling this is something in a far off place. When I hear the news, we'll get into this, that North Korea is sending these troops in, and is already potentially manning batteries of missiles, and those are being deployed against Ukrainian cities. This is quite literally an invasion of Europe. Ukraine is Europe. Its skies are European skies. Its cities are European cities. Its values are European values. And that's something I sort of want to get into there, because most people think that you're mad. I've been called an extremist even by some friends. How could you go there, etc. It's as if it's the end of the world. Well, I can tell everyone it's not the end of the world. This is really the heart of Europe that this is happening in. And we pretend it's not at our peril, and actually we enable things like this further incursion by North Korea by compartmentalizing our minds and pretending that this does not relate to us and this will not happen to us. Well, I have news. It will, and it can.
Well, the news about North Korea deploying about 50,000 combat troops into eventually into Ukraine, and as you briefly mentioned, they've already supplied a ballistic missile team, which I believe has about 90 personnel that's being actually rolled into the Russian army. And these are ballistic missiles that are and will be fired into Ukraine from Russia. And you're right. This is an Asian army, 50,000 people. And, think about that. 50,000 is larger than the armies of many countries, including some that belong to NATO. Some of the smaller nations.
It's larger than I believe I don't know how many combat troops Britain actually has that could be deployed, but this is it's a significant number. Again, we dismiss it at our peril.
Well, absolutely, and if Ukraine had the ability, of course, they would attack North Korea. But what I want to say is that this is, for all intents and purposes, whether it's official or not, an act of war. Obviously, this is a declaration of war against Ukraine by North Korea. And as you said, people are just kind of, oh, well, what else is new? We have so many other crises. The price of gas is so high. The price of food in my grocery store is sky high, that they don't really think about it. And, I get that. Everybody has to deal with this in their own way. But this is a very, very significant event. It is, and you alluded to this, it's an invasion of Europe by an Eastern or Asian nation in collaboration with Russia, who's made it not a secret that Putin's goal is to recapture not the Soviet Union, the Russian Empire. And this is being part of that plan. He's using one of the poorest nations on earth to do this. So is more than happy. Let me show this smiling fool here just a moment. This is the, it's not, there we go. No, that's not it. That's another thing. But no, it's not allowing me to do this right now. The president, the illustrious president, who cuts quite a fashion figure every day, is collaborating with Putin, and that is a marriage made in hell. I don't know where this is going to go. Like I said, I know if Ukraine had the ability, they would declare war on Ukraine and just bomb the hell out of them or drone the hell out of them. Let me ask you this. What do you think is going to happen with this? I mean, where will this lead to, this North Korean invasion in the short term in terms of the security of Europe?
I mean, there are multiple directions and actually multiple things going on at the same time. This is, I think, trolls use this unfortunately to say, okay, but hey, you said Ukraine's winning, blah blah. Look at this, or you say Russia's losing. Look at that, blah blah blah. It's possible that certain things can be going in different directions at the same time. Russia can be uh, cruel and powerful in some respects and brittle and weak in others, and it can be that simultaneously. Ukraine can be paying a devastatingly high price for resisting Russian aggression, and yet can still have the tide turning towards it. There are multiple complex strands sort of going on here. Obviously, history or folkloric history tends to write fairly simplistic outcomes to things, such as the Second World War, divide it into winners and losers. That doesn't mean there aren't sort of multiple directions going on, and there will be points where there's this extreme, precariousness. When you're in it, you don't know how things are going to pan out. One of those trends, of course, is within Russia itself, and the direction it could go in, whether that is a full Stalinist North Korea trajectory. If the current regime stays in power and feels that it requires war in order to stay in power, then we are heading towards a North Korea type scenario with ever increasing jeopardy and risk, not just for Ukraine, but for all of Europe and potentially the free world. If the regime in Moscow, under which there is below the surface, a struggle going on, not so much to end the war or because they care about Ukrainians, but there is a struggle going on between those who at least think a modicum of market forces are required in order to preserve their wealth and their position within the system. There is a group of people who do not want to go down the neo-Stalinist route, and not out of any major ideals, liberal values, simply because they know they will not prosper in that scenario, that their fortunes will be taken off them and they'll be lucky to escape with their lives. They know that that trajectory is potentially kind of bad news. If that struggle goes one way or the other, this may well determine, that particular outcome, and it may well determine what happens in the war in Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine, in its phase where it's getting stronger, where it's holding Russia at bay, means that it could very much capitalize on some form of systemic collapse in Russia. It could capitalize on some kind of confrontation between different factions within Russia. That is a sort of black swan type event that we can hope for, but we probably can't engineer. But it's certainly a possibility. Then they could have all the Korean troops in the world, but if they're part of a collapsing regime and a collapsing front, then that won't really help them too much. As someone's pointed out, 50,000 sounds huge, but actually attrition rates at the front are between 25 and 35,000 per month. So this is less than 2 months' supply of bodies, and Russia is certainly running out of those domestically. So would they be able to overrun parts of the front? Would they be able to overrun Ukraine with these bodies? Absolutely not. There's no conceivable way in which they can win this war or take the whole of Donbass, even with this huge injection of human fertilizer. What they can do, of course, and this is where our humanistic values come in, they could certainly put a lot of pressure on Ukraine and cause the unnecessary deaths of many brave Ukrainian warriors. Whether it has a strategic impact on the battlefield, I'm very doubtful as to that. This is a drone-saturated battlefield. Ukraine is ramping up its production of drones month on month in a spectacular fashion, and the lethality and the effectiveness of these is increasing at the same time. So it may well be that the injection of North Koreans is not going to have a huge effect. I think it's the strategic impact of because at the moment North Koreans haven't actually fought on Ukrainian soil.
Very few, anyway. Yes.
Well, we don't have any evidence. We don't have any evidence they've been on Ukrainian soil. It's in the retaking of Kursk that they were primarily involved.
I think there was one prisoner that there was.
Yeah, there was one prisoner. Yeah, and that was probably taken on Russian territory and brought back.
Yes.
And then there's some funny stories about Korean prisoners and various things. I mean, one of those being the story about the first time these North Koreans discovered porn on mobile phones, and
Yes.
yeah, I mean
Yeah.
they forgot to eat it. Anyway, you can
Well,
nitpick
I
that.
mean, what's frightening among many other facts about this scenario is the possible merger of the totalitarian regimes of North Korea and
Yes.
Putin. I mean, Putin, if anything, and it's hard to say this, but is getting worse in terms of his police state and his clamping down on any even breath of an opposition. In fact, there was an op-ed. I
And
think it was in the,
systemic. He's gone off to the systemic opposition now,
absolutely.
which until now had been perfectly fine to sort of. I mean, the only person who seems to be immune from any of this is of course Ksenia Sobchak, who I've always said is
Yeah.
is the queen of the systemic opposition. But anyway,
Oh
that's
yeah.
another topic.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, I was going to say that there was an interesting piece today in the New York Times by Khrushchev's adopted granddaughter, Khrushchevna, who is a professor at, I believe it's NYU or Columbia. And she was talking about this topic specifically, and about how she fears that Putin's Russia is rapidly descending into a Stalinesque type of 1930s purge. Very fast. And that she really fears that it's going to get far worse than it even is now. And it's pretty bad. And you add the fuel onto the fire of this merging of armies, ideologies, weapons, and so forth of North Korea, not to mention it. We didn't talk about Iran and the agreements and solidarity between Russia and Iran. And this is a real scary scenario. I had asked you about the future of the nationals or the security of Europe. I mean, that triumvirate by itself spreads over an enormous amount of area that could possibly be going up in flames when these three, continue to work together against the West.
Yes. Yes, and just the very idea that a North Korean army would be active on the territory of Europe just a decade or two ago, maybe 2 decades ago, would have sent people to an absolute tailspin.
Well,
There would have been
Jonathan, as you
a
know, too,
call to do something about it.
well, as you know, North Korea is just like Putin. I mean, he uses his people as cannon fodder. So there's almost an unlimited supply of worm food that will be coming
Yes.
from North Korea. So although 50,000 isn't anywhere near enough to conquer Ukraine and to control it, of course, if it's a steamroller, if they just keep replacing them with new bodies, untrained or not. I mean, as you know, sometimes volume does conquer quality. And they have their own drones too. Of course, they have quite a number of those. So it's a big danger. I don't see North Korea being the turning point here, the game changer, but I think it's pretty frightening.
It's absolutely terrifying, and of course, at the end of the day, Ukrainian lives are precious. The lives of the invaders are not treated by their country as precious, and I don't actually care about the invaders and what happens to them, but I do care about Ukrainians. It is the best people Ukraine sends. It's people who were typically now not in the military. It's people who've gone to defend their own country, defend their land, their families, prevent their children and women folk from being raped and killed, which, as we know, what Russian troops do. I have no reason to think that North Korean troops would behave any differently. We would see a level of barbarity which is equal to that which has been seen by many of the areas that Russia has invaded. It's a terrifying prospect. What should be done, though? That is the key question. And we hark back to what I was saying in the first weeks of the war, right back when this podcast started, which is that we need to treat Ukrainian skies as European skies. We need to close them. We do not need to declare a direct war against Russia. We just need to say that this is sovereign territory of a European ally, and this is where it stops. Your barbarity will not hold here, and make it very clear that if you step over that line, if your planes are seen in the air in this vicinity, they will be seen as hostile and they will be taken out. Simple as that. That still holds. At this point, a line should be drawn and Ukraine should be given everything it needs in order to repel the invaders, especially those coming from, as you say, an Asiatic authoritarian nation. European troops and armies, even if they're not prepared to say guard the borders or take control of some of the internal functions that could release Ukrainian men, which would be very beneficial at this time. If they're not prepared to send Ukrainian men who are in Europe back to do their duty, if we're not prepared to take those steps, we can at least give Ukraine the tools to do the job.
I agree with you. And after all this time, after all the misery and the deaths and the suffering that's taken place in Ukraine, to have NATO, either individual countries or NATO as a whole, refuse to close the skies. And I've been advocating that with you from the very start. It's mind-boggling that hasn't been done. Or, as you just suggested, to put even not a token force, but to put enough boots on the ground, say in eastern Ukraine, in Donbass, to seal the border. And to make sure that these atrocities don't happen and no new troops come over. Not to do that is just incredible to me. It really is. And if they're afraid that Putin's going to launch nukes, just get over it. It's been a long time. He's not going to do that. And to say that they're afraid of a direct conflict between NATO and Putin, I'll tell you right now, I think it's pretty clear that, at least at this time, Putin does not want to get into a direct conflict with NATO. So if you stationed NATO troops on the ground and in the air protecting the skies, I'm going to go out on a limb here. And I'm going to say that this war would end a lot sooner than it normally would with Russia retreating.
We have to ask ourselves the question, what is Putin doing via his war? He is trying to perpetuate his regime. That's exactly what he is doing.
Yeah.
So using tactical nukes, getting to the next level would actually, it may even accelerate the process of his regime being toppled, because there'll be people, I believe, internally within the system who have their own red lines around this. They do not want to see necessarily Europe nuked and any way back to, let's say, civilized life, as far as they're concerned, having that come down and being completely precluded. The question I have here, then, this is the most worrying one, and this could actually determine partly where things go. And I had this conversation with Constantine earlier today, which is going to be published tomorrow. There are several scenarios. Russia goes the full North Korea route. It mobilizes and it carries on the war until its resources are entirely spent. And we see some form of internal systemic collapse, maybe even a civil war breaking out, at least between the factions that are vying for control. That's certainly one scenario. Another scenario is that Putin sort of magically sees sense and freezes the lines of contact, etc. At this point, that seems not to be so likely, and that Putin is getting very poor and manipulative information, probably, in order to perpetuate the war, from the kind of war class, those that typically within the Siloviki or who've benefited massively from the war. They don't want to see it stop, because if it stops, if that merry-go-round stops going round, they're likely to lose their fortunes and their lives. This is certainly something Constantine pointed out. So whether they want to freeze the lines or continue, they probably no longer have the option. So we are looking at North Korean scenario almost as inevitability. That would, in my view, inevitably lead to some kind of systemic collapse, a collapse of the lines, and a struggle for power within Russia. Eventually, we can't say when and exactly how it will play out, but that is a likely outcome of that, unless, of course, the faction that is pro-war and that is controlling Putin at this point, unless they make a deal with China, and this presumes China needs more war, to say, okay, we are now a full vassal. You give us the resources to perpetuate the war that keeps us in power. So that's kind of the Stalinist route, but one where a faction within Russia, the faction behind Putin, becomes an overt vassal of China in order to maintain their grip on power. That absolutely requires war, and the framework of it to perpetuate that. So this then comes to the question of whether China wants more war. What are its eventual aims? And of course, with North Korea joining, that to me suggests, at least for now, China believes that continuing the pressure on the world system, continuing the pressure on Europe via Ukraine, continuing the pressure on depleting the world's, let's say, interceptor resources, fits with their wider plan. That unfortunately suggests to me that more war is part of China's plan, and they may well perpetuate that through their vassals and proxies, which of course Russia is rapidly becoming, if not already become.
Yeah, I was going to bring up China in just a moment anyway. I mean, any scenarios that involve China, as far as Russia is concerned, are problematic. You talked about what would be the advantages, if any, for Putin to drop a tactical nuke in or around Ukraine. I think that China would take a very dim view on that. They already have. And behind the scenes, they have cautioned Putin not to do that. If he did do that, I think this would have a dramatic effect on the relations between Russia and China, because as aggressive as China is, and they are in almost every way, I don't think they want such an extreme disruption to the international economy, to the way things work. They're to the point where they're controlling commerce, the international economy, science, innovation, and so forth. I don't think they want nukes dropping in Europe, which is going to disrupt all of that. As far as though what you were saying, Russia becoming a full vassal state of China, I think they already are. You said that. They pretty much are. What's missing is an official declaration of that, or some kind of a diplomatic understanding. But let me ask you this about that, Jonathan. How do you think the Russian people, and I know they're not going to rise up at the gates of the Kremlin, but how do you think they would feel if it was officially announced that we are now a vassal state of the modern day Mongols and take Russia back 600-700 years?
I mean, this is going to be de facto. But the thing is, I don't think most people, or one, that announcement wouldn't be overt. Of course, that's one thing. You wouldn't sort of wake up and suddenly, Moscow television is all being delivered in Korean or Chinese. But that has essentially already happened in areas bordering southern Russia, which many of, ironically, used to be owned by China prior to events in the 20th century. It is de facto Chinese. They don't need to state sovereignty over it. They don't need to fight over it. Essentially, the resources are all theirs for the taking. They're able to bribe or work with local politicians to gain access to all the resources they
pretty
need.
much own Lake Baikal and the surrounding area.
This is it, and they have various production companies. They don't even need to, I guess, legally own all the production companies. All you need to do is have politicians and the people you need in your pocket in order to do that.
So you think the Russian people, even if it gradually eased into a vassalship with China, wouldn't really have that big of a problem with it?
Sorry, that was just an interruption there, familial interruption.
Understood.
They've run away with my phone, which makes me very nervous. But people, I mean, first of all, there will be people who understand that this is not good within the Russian political hierarchy, but this is not exactly how that system works. Those who are not content with it probably will not be able to do anything about it. Mostly people will be wondering how that affects the power vertical, how that affects the distribution of resources, how that affects my position within it. The fact that your big boss, who you could, that you have to подчинить, you have to sort of comply with, now has a bigger boss. Does that really affect the power vertical? Does that affect your position within it? Or actually, does that make the power vertical more stable? Does it make your position within it more assured? I don't think people, many in Russia and those necessarily who are powerful, are going to be thinking about this in the way that a Western politically minded audience would be. And I think it's, again, very dangerous for us to try to impose our own frameworks and understanding of it onto that system. I think in some ways it will feel bizarrely natural for many Russians to be part of a larger vertical where the biggest, nastiest boss now has a slightly bigger and nastier boss. I mean, it really won't affect too many people that much. And if it guarantees access to resources, if it guarantees some, let's say, how you call it, luxuries within life, some prestige, then most people will go along with it because that's what they've already done. I think people ignore the fact that this has already happened. A bargain was made with Putin in the early 2000s where power was surrendered to the vertical. All political agency was surrendered to the vertical. All real control over resource distribution was surrendered to the vertical. And in exchange, people got scraps from the table. Those who were unhappy with it, the sort of 5 to 10% who probably less than that in, say, media organizations like Gosinski's NTV and so on, the figure was about, I think, sort of 5 to 10% of the journalists so on working in the free media within Russia objected to becoming part of the systemically controlled media. Well, they were at that point free to leave. So I don't expect Russia becoming a vassal of China will change much for most people. What it will do, however, is potentially perpetuate the war, because it will be a clear signal that what China needs is still more pressure. Maybe it's not entirely assured that that Russia is a vassal severed from Europe, whose markets it dominates, whose access to whose resources it can monopolize. It may feel that more war is required to shake up the international order and to fully remove any vestiges of sovereignty from Russia, or it may decide that that process has now gone far enough and the rules have been broken and eroded down to their base level, and it can now start rebuilding the world in China's image. I suspect that hasn't happened yet because Taiwan is still uninvaded. The US does have some military power and some reserves still left, even though a lot is being depleted on the utterly ludicrous, adventure in Iran. That, I think, the depletion of US military power and reserves is part of the broader game that's being played here behind the scenes as well, fully intentional.
Well, I agree with you about the ability of the Russian people to just accept being swallowed whole, if need be, as a vassal state of China. Look, the majority of the Russian population, you mentioned 5 to 10% of the media, perhaps, or 5 to 10% of the population, which were formerly the free media, disagreed, and many of them or most have left. But the majority of the Russian population, outside of the elites, the oligarchs, actually still miss the Soviet Union, or at least, if not the Soviet Union, the feeling that they were a real player, that they were a very powerful country, that they were a large country that encompassed many, many other nationalities and had their boot on the neck of all of these countries, that they were, right up there. And that still smarts to them, which is why I believe that they pretty much support all the recent aggression of Putin in Ukraine, all his talk about possibly attacking NATO, nuking London, and all these other crazy things. Medvedev and talking about France will be first with a nuclear attack, all that nonsense. The Russian people like that. They want to be back on top. They want the Russian Empire back. So I agree with you, Jonathan. I think that they would. Most of them wouldn't fight at all. They'd be perfectly happy under the umbrella of a China, and even incorporating a despotic North Korean type of a situation, a government or an ideology into that type of a partnership. I think it's disgusting, but we cannot look at it the way that you might look at it in England or the States or Europe. It doesn't work that way in Russia.
No, and this isn't 1917. I make the point, and I spoke to some friends about this over the weekend. I mean, Russia was more sophisticated politically in the Silver Age prior to the February Revolution in 1917. More diverse, more sophisticated politically, with far more of what could be described as various opposition forces or opposition based on different classes and groupings in society. And the intelligence services did not have the almost limitless sort of power that they now hold, at least there was the potential to create what could be described as something like a maybe a liberal oligarchy or some kind of democratic oligarchy, or there was another system potentially nascent there. What we have now is a system that's entirely metastasized, a population that is being bred to have no sense of agency, to fear politics. The distribution of resources is entirely systemic. And for those who still haven't quite twigged how that hierarchy works, it works through reward and humiliation. Humiliation is a huge part of that system, which means that if China comes in and humiliates Russia, they're not going to react in the same way that, let's say, Britain would at a full loss of sovereignty, or dare I say, even America or other countries in Europe. No, it's just another layer of humiliation, which actually, if the perception is that humiliation, terror, punishment, violence is what constitutes order in that system, then the introduction of China into the equation is not the sort of chaos and upending of order that we would interpret it to be. It is perhaps just the addition or the extension of that order, or maybe even in some people's minds, an improvement in that hierarchy of violence, humiliation, coercion, and oppression.
You know, until the last few years, namely when Trump came on the scene, I, like most Americans, I believe, at least those with my background in philosophy, could never understand how the Russian people under the Soviet Union and then under Putin could tolerate such tyranny, such a deprivation of their rights, and being under the boot of the Siloviki, whether it was the NKVD, the KGB, the FSB. I couldn't understand how they would just hide and curl into a fetal position and just accept this. It was beyond my understanding. However, since Trump came on the scene, especially in the last few years, I've witnessed firsthand how that can happen, even in a very democratic country like the United States, where fully 50% of the at least adult population is more than receptive to having a tyrant, to having a czar or a king, and more than happy to give up their civil and any other kind of rights in order to listen to a demagogue, in order to listen to a man who says, only I have the answer, and blames everyone else, and everyone else is the enemy of the state, to borrow the Soviet phrase. Until I saw this close up, and now for many, many years, I couldn't believe how the Russian people can do that. Now I know. It just takes a leader and a political party made up of cowards who are more than happy to bend knee to such a tyrant to turn around many, many years of democracy. And in a country like Russia, as you know, that's never had democracy, really wasn't that hard.
It wasn't that hard. No, they took him a couple of years to institute it, to sort of clear out the vestiges, as it were, or in this case, the sort of nascent foundations of a democratic system. But honestly, it wasn't that hard, and there've been no real challenges to Putin and his system since then. What, of course, to me is surprising is those who talk about freedom so vociferously, especially those on the American right. But also, unfortunately, on the left, we have a lot of, let's say, useful idiots for Putin, maybe some assets too. It's just the alacrity, as you say, with which people are prepared to either fall down a sort of rabbit hole or be at each other's throats and be manipulated into doing so, or to simply, negate any agency or political agents they have. Sometimes for delusional ideas, sometimes for nothing more than just access to the trough, as it were.
Yeah, utter agreed, and that's been put made very, very clear in the United States in terms of the out and out greed that is behind all of this, from Trump on down, and all his many, many financial scandals and grift, down to it's just accepted. If you can steal, if you can take away from the government or even from another person or a company, today here it's just accepted, as it has been in the Soviet Union, or at least in Russia now since the 90s. That's just the way it is. If you could steal and get away with it, so much the better, because that's what our government does. Let me, in the time we have remaining, let me go on to, as I said, a more positive note. I am very excited to read about the developments in the Ukrainian, not just the drones, which they are now the world leader. In fact, the United States just accepted a large shipment of drones from Ukraine. Because our drone development is so abysmal that we are gladly accepting the designs and actual drones from Ukraine, as well as their technicians and designers who are here right now working with the United States Army. But I want to talk about with you just a little bit, and I put this up a little bit earlier, the Flamingo. They've already had a Flamingo, and it's seen limited success deployment in Russia. It's been very successful, but they haven't been able to produce enough of them yet. They are in the process of deploying the next generation Flamingo as early as this fall, which can hit targets pretty much all over European Russia, including Moscow, St. Petersburg, and other areas. But they're, like I said, next year, by the middle of the year, they estimate they're going to have the next generation beyond that, which is going to be a ballistic missile, faster and more accurate than anything they have, much cheaper to produce and manufacture, in conjunction with at least 2 European countries who are going to make like the guidance systems, GPS, and so forth. Very excited about that. Did you hear or see anything about that while you were there in Ukraine?
Only the public reports that you've seen, the same sort of ones. Yeah, but operationally, I think this is a significant step. We've been seeing the degradation of wildberries. We've been seeing all sorts of speculation about what that is for, what it's hoping to achieve, what the strategic plan behind it was. I happen to think that this is far more strategic than people make out. It's not just entertainment. You don't expend this level of capability just to create some memes, quite honestly. And some of the journalists, some of the commentators who've suggested that that's what it's all about, either that it's about revenge on Russians, or you just want to make Russians feel bad, or, you just want to strike something to create some memes. I mean, I find that actually insulting to the intelligence of Ukraine, and it's not a good reflection on whoever writes those kind of pieces. There were many, and there was one utterly disingenuous one, which suggested that Ukrainians are just doing this for fun. Are they fighting to prevent themselves being erased for fun as well? I'd like to ask that journalist what exactly they're thinking when they write that kind of
well, the other thing that's very exciting, Jonathan, is the fact that these are primarily offensive weapons that we're talking about, the Flamingo, both generations, but they are also working with the Europeans, several European countries, on a defensive Patriot-like missile system, which should also be deployed very shortly. I don't know exactly how long, but in the next few months, which would be comparable to the new generation Patriot missiles, in the fact that they would be able to shoot down with great accuracy the Russian ballistic missiles that are constantly hammering Ukraine. So when both of those systems are deployed, the defensive anti-ballistic missile system that they're developing with European countries, and the Flamingo offensive system that will be utterly decimating targets far inside of Russia, which I understand. Actually, I just want to say the piece I read today said that one of these new Flamingo missiles could reach ranges of up to 8,000 kilometers, which is staggering. That's not been finished. It's not deployed. It's still in the research and testing phase. But if that's true, obviously that's way into Siberia. That's into far eastern Russia.
Nothing is secure there. But actually, you don't need to take out Siberia. You need to take out Moscow.
No,
and I think the idea
there was one site though in I think it's Archangel, which is in the northern Arctic in Siberia, which was a major development site for the military, and that's one of the reasons they wanted to develop that range, I believe.
Yeah, I think it's good, and of course you have the LG, the LNG production, etc. The gas is still being shipped to Europe. Well, there may be some political consequences for sinking those LNG transport ships. But actually, if you take out the production and logistics
Yes.
sites on Russian territory, yeah, what's Europe going to do? What's Europe going to do? You're going to have to pay more for your gas instead of fueling the Russian war machine, which is causing slaughter and strategic undermining our own continent.
Germany, and I think it might be the Netherlands, is still buying
France,
Russian
Belgium,
gas,
yeah,
LPG, gasoline, you name it. It has not, contrary to what many will believe, the restrictions, I can't think of the word right now, but the fact that Russia is not supposed to be able to sell any of their natural resources to Europe is a fallacy. Because the business people in Europe just won't accept it. They don't care that their very existence as a nation may be in jeopardy. They want to see that almighty euro. And they're still doing business with Russia. Sanctions, I'm sorry. Even with the sanctions on Russia, they're still buying Russian energy.
They are. And long-range sanctions, the only cure to this,
Yes.
the same as Nord Stream. I mean, there's a non-zero chance that Ukraine or Ukraine-affiliated forces blow that up. But actually, at this point, it's not just why not, but it is strategically sensible. If you're fighting for your life, if you're fighting to preserve the lives of your people, it would be remiss if you did not take these steps.
Sure.
Take out the Yamal Cross, take out the LNG processing, take out everything you can of the aggressor nation. These are the lessons that Europe needs to learn and has conspicuously not learned. More money is flowing into the Russian war machine via Europe than is flowing to Ukraine. We are paying quite literally for our own destruction. We are paying for the rope to hang ourselves as well as our ally that is bleeding out Ukraine. There's no excuse.
If NATO wanted to actually enforce the sanctions as they're supposed to be, obviously they wouldn't be buying Russian energy, but they'd also sink the damn shadow fleet, not just take them into custody and search them. That's good. But once they don't learn and they keep flowing and shipping all over the world, and despite the sanctions and the secondary sanctions, sink them. Sink them. Just sink them. Torpedo them, bomb them, whatever you have to do. But they're obviously not serious. Let me ask you this then. We talked about what you mentioned about hammering the economy and the strategic mission that Ukraine is on. What about Wildberries? I think this is a brilliant move. Do you think this is actually having a real effect on not just the Russian economy, but on Russian psyche? And if so, is it going to get worse for the Russians?
Of course, it's having an effect on their psyche. And there are those who are recording TikTok videos to say, well, why are we being hit? We didn't hurt anyone. I mean, that's just the idiots, right? That's just the small, let's say, I don't know how, many people think like that. I suggest they're a minority, they're a significant minority. There are many people who understand exactly what's happening. There are many who can see that Ukraine's long-range sanctions are not targeting civilians. And okay, there are civilian casualties, but that's not the point of them. Therefore, they're not going to shelters. They're not seeking shelter. They're filming these strikes because they know that they are not the target. And Ukraine does not just randomly lob munitions at its enemy. It has a strategic purpose each time. So yes, there is a psychological effect. Will it result in anything? Well, first of all, none of these people can do anything about their regime anymore. They had 20 years when they could, but they absolved themselves of that responsibility in order to live quiet lives and get rich. That will not happen now that the full apparatus of the intelligence services is swinging towards a kind of neo-Stalinism. I think that's been the trajectory right from the point where sanitary laws were introduced during COVID in Russia. That trajectory was only ever going in one direction, that is towards Stalinism, that we talked about earlier. So yes, it's interesting. And yes, Russians will be disconcerted, and yes, they'll lose their privileged 21st century lifestyles, and they will phase shift down to a sort of grim Soviet-like existence. Fine. Will it change anything? No. What it will do, I think, is put huge pressure on the vestiges of the market economy, on the banking system. What it is doing is pushing Russia into the next phase shift. The next phase shift is from a quasi-market economy into a full centralized North Korean dictatorship, where all resources are allocated by the state. I think Ukraine strategically understands that you need that phase shift in order to accelerate whatever happens next, whatever power struggle needs to emerge within Russia. And without this pressure, Russia could probably balance the, quasi-market economy delusion for another year or two before its resources are depleted. So this is having an accelerating effect, increasing the brittleness of Putin's system, forcing difficult choices and a phase shift onto it, which the regime might try to avoid. That doesn't guarantee anything whatsoever, but it's the only thing you can do with such a monolithic, ridiculous sort of structure as Russia, such a primitive political entity where you really need clan warfare to kick in before anything substantially will change.
There's been so many reports recently about the possibility, and some people are screaming it's a probability of a massive conscription this autumn, this fall in Russia. What do you think the chances of that are?
I think it's very close. I wouldn't call it inevitable, but I think it's extremely likely. The fact that these North Korean troops are being drafted in is not a replacement for Russian bodies. It's in recognition that Russian bodies are lacking, let alone, for major new offensives. They're lacking simply to hold the line. So for those who are thinking this is part of a move to overwhelm Ukraine, that somehow victory, Putin may believe actually that minor victories will be achieved, retaking or taking the whole of the Donbass. He may believe that's possible. It's not. In reality, this is necessary simply to hold the line and prevent a systemic, let's say, disintegration of the lines of contact on the Russian side, I believe. So this is interesting and terrifying, but we should not, as some journalists will take it, as a sign that Ukraine is heading for inevitable defeat. No, I think this is more evidence of Russia's move towards a point where the war will be unsustainable. And if they will then later rely on 10, 15, 20,000 North Korean bodies per month, that tells us an awful lot, which is that Russia is depleted, can no longer supply the fodder it needs to even maintain its position, let alone what it calls advance.
Well, the next obvious question is, what do you think the response would be from the Russian public to a massive conscription in the next few months?
We're 4.5 years in. People fled for the borders. We will not see such an overt declaration of mass mobilization. It will be a so-called skryte, or hidden mass mobilization. It'll achieve the same ends, but they're not going to announce it. What they will do is crack down on people's ability to remove money from their savings, to buy train tickets, to buy fuel. Why is Putin maybe not panicking about the fuel shortages? Well, firstly, he probably doesn't know the extent of them. Secondly, he may want an immobile population, unable to physically head for the borders. And at this point, that fuel shortage makes it a lot more difficult for that. The borders are also being manned by, both their usual sort of militarized passport control, but also intelligence officers. They've geared up. They've been building up the bars on the cage for precisely this moment. We know, and Konstantin sort of alluded to this in our conversations going out tomorrow, that there are many people withdrawing their savings, withdrawing their money, trying to turn their assets into something that's liquid, or they're doing the squirrel thing, which is to basically take their assets and somehow bury them in Russia so they can come back and retrieve them later. Anyone who's got a brain, anyone who's got assets, is trying to get them and their families out of the country. This is the anecdotal stories that we're starting to get through. That to me suggests, plus the geopolitical strategic kind of picture, suggests to me that mobilization is almost entirely assured, unless Putin somehow is deposed by another faction before then. I think there's a very, very low chance of that, very, very high chance of mass mobilization combined with an injection of North Korean troops, may give Putin the false belief that actually he can effect some kind of breakthrough. This year, of course, by the time all these resources are there and the election has happened, it seems important for some kind of internal legitimacy to have the Duma elections. This is something I talked with Vlad Exler about. I don't quite understand why a dictatorship needs to have these sort of symbols of proprietary and because technically they should be mobilizing now if they want to have any kind of effect whatsoever. No, they'll do it. And these forces will come to bear just as the winter's kicking in, when they have the least chance of, I think, actually having any kind of breakthrough. There'll be less or no leaf cover as the trees lose their leaves. These invading forces will stand out more, one would presume, in the snow than they currently do. So this is gearing up to a slaughter, perhaps on a scale we've not yet seen in the war, and strategic idiocy on another level. But again, none of this is a surprise, unfortunately, from Russia and from Putin, who is not a strategic thinker, does not learn the lessons of his mistakes.
Yeah, I agree with you about the mobilization, and there's so many indicators there. Another one that I've read a lot about is the fact that many banks are limiting the amount of cash that the Russians can withdraw. Some of them are just refusing to withdraw any cash at all. They said, nope, that's it. Bank's closed. You can't withdraw anything. So, these are all indicators.
There are limits. There are fairly low limits now, daily
yeah.
limits on what people can physically withdraw from any bank.
And there's new laws, electronic laws, where Putin now is they're sending draft notices electronically, so people can't say that they didn't get it in the mail or the post, as they call it, because everybody has a cell phone. So
they've built the cage. They built the cage,
exactly.
And the door is ready to slam shut at any moment. They've already been testing the system earlier in the year, which means that the internet can be shut down at any point, anywhere in the country, including apps, including every electronic
make it VPN
means
proof.
whatsoever. It'll all be shut down. They've gained control of the entire infrastructure, and they're ready and waiting. And the question is whether they're doing that in order to be able to control the environment in the event of some kind of coup or some kind of systemic banking crisis, or whether those two things, which are triggered by a mobilization, in any case, they've built the digital physical cage to keep Russians in and to then funnel them towards the war. And this is only going to go in one direction, and that direction is very, very dark and very grim.
And if the security services, the Siloviki and the oligarchs decide that, well, this is pretty grim, but I can still make a good living out of this, I'll be fine as long as I toe the line, we're not going to see a coup. I'm not saying it can't happen. I don't think we are. And for anybody out there who still thinks the Russian people are going to rise up, get over it. It's not going to happen.
It's not going to happen. I mean, Konstantin has an even darker theory as to why the war will be perpetuated. But there will come a point where certain factions will have to choose a side, either fully with the Siloviki or with the, I don't want to call them reformers because they're not, but with the sort of quasi-liberal market forces people. At some point, there will become a line where that turns into more or less open warfare. And if you side with one or the other or the loser, you will lose everything, your resources, your businesses, your life. This is what comes next. Rather than revolution, we could see the total requisitioning, as it were, of all the resources of one side by the other. And unfortunately, I think it's the intelligence services that will win out. Those that have the least understanding of how a market economy functions, they likely will have the instruments of terror in their hands. That also happens to be the pro-war faction, pro-regime, pro-war faction.
The total backing of Putin, that's his background.
Total backing of Putin, exactly right. And Konstantin goes further and suggests that Putin may now just be a puppet of theirs.
That's possible.
Because he seems to be increasingly incoherent. They give him little folders and brown envelopes. He signs them. It's a total fiction. It may well be he's just something of a rubber stamp behind a group that is this so-called pro-war Siloviki faction. And they're powerful. I'm sure they are.
You had mentioned Constantine a few times. I'm not going to get into that because I want to ask you off air how much of that, you feel comfortable in discussing, because he's in a very unique position. So maybe next time we can discuss him.
And the last thing I'll say there, I won't say him specifically, but the last thing I'll say here is that in 2021, prior to full-scale invasion, we saw a ratcheting up of repression, albeit soft compared to what we're seeing now. We saw they failed to do that in 2022 when people fled for the borders, and they now realize that was a big mistake. So if they are going to go for a full mobilization, which I believe they are, that means they're going to be putting in place severely restrictive and repressive measures in the coming weeks and months. And actually, we're already seeing it already now. You're going to see certain systemic opposition, or those that are slightly in opposition to the government, or saying things that are slightly different to the Kremlin. You're going to start seeing a lot of these people either disappear or come to a sticky end. I think this is the inevitable preparation over the next couple of months that we will see, and it'll be further indicators that we're heading towards a full mobilization.
Dark times, my friend. Dark times coming up. No question about it. That's going to be it for today's podcast on the No Delusion Zone. Please watch, support, and subscribe to the No Delusion Zone. Need all your support that I can get. We're closing in on 60,000 subscribers and hopefully 100,000 by the end of the year, but can't do it without you. Jonathan, as always, thank you very much. Hang around for just a second after we finish, and hopefully we will be seeing you here very, very soon. Take care, my friend.
Cheers. Thank you.